So hopefully this will not be too boring.
Yeah.
If it is, you got free food anyway. So.
Why I came.
So I thought for a couple minutes I just talk about the book a little bit, and then do some reading from the book, and I have a couple of my poems that I'll sprinkle in. So hopefully that'll be worthwhile for us tonight. So the book basically springs from a couple of my concerns that I've always had since I came back to Christianity. And that's one is how Christianity is perceived in the media, that the fundamentalism kind of has become the face of Christians and Christianity that gets portrayed. And there's a lot of people who don't know that anything else exists other than what they see in the newspaper. And then the other thing is kind of goes with that is just saddened by those who coming out of fundamentalism or affected by it end up rejecting Christianity or even a spiritual path in general because they can see the hypocrisy and other problems with those doctrines, those fundamental doctrines. And so in a way, the book is my attempt to address kind of those concerns. It came out of a constructive theology paper, which is the capstone for Master of Divinity students at Chicago Theological Seminary. That's the paper you write at the very end of your degree. And then I took that paper and then supplemented it with other reflections and sermons that I've preached and few other seminary papers to come up with a book. So, constructive theology itself, if you're not familiar with that term, is basically theology, talk about God, that's built from different sources. And so constructive kind of implies you're in dialogue with other theologians, church tradition and doctrine, scripture, your own personal experiences, perhaps culture. It's really using all those things as building blocks to build your theology, what you want to say about God. And so the book, because it comes out of that paper, is kind of divided into some classical theological subjects. So you'll find chapters about God and humanity, about sin and about Jesus, and so on. And then it tries to talk about a lot of the traditional teachings that people may find problematic and alternative ways we might approach those. So I hope the book is going to be of interest to progressive Christians and people that identify that way. Perhaps anyone who's interested in spirituality but who's put off or disillusioned by traditional Christian doctrine. Anyone who's raised as a Christian but isn't sure what they believe anymore. Anyone who thinks fundamentalism represents all Christians, because it doesn't. And that's part of the message I want people to walk away from my book. So other messages, just that the reader, I hope, will take away is just some interesting and compelling alternatives to concepts that they might struggle with. And maybe some inspiration and permission to explore their spirituality and relationship with the divine in new ways that they haven't thought of before or experienced before. And so I want to do a little bit of reading and give you a taste of the book, and no refunds, by the way. If you've already bought the book, it's yours. So the first is from the chapter on God. It's pages 40 and 41 if you happen to have a copy with you. So talking about God as love. Where might we be led if we took this assertion that the divine presence is love more seriously? Paul Tillich offers the insight that love has to do with separation and reunion. One element of love is the desire to be united and in relationship with that which we love, so we might be fulfilled. As love, the divine presence is the force which works to bring every creature which is separated or disrupted to fulfillment in the unity of the divine. As love, then, the divine presence is more than an emotion. It is an active and radical force that works to break down the walls that separate us from each other and from the divine, and therefore enables reunion, a coming together of creature and divinity. It makes possible the finding of wholeness. Love as the divine presence in this sense might be likened to the force of gravity, which acts to pull two separated bodies together and hold them there in relationship with each other. Love exerts a pull on creation, calling and luring it toward wholeness, our fullest becoming. In this metaphor, the divine presence becomes the gravitational force of love, and its pull toward wholeness represents how the divine acts in our lives. The emotional component of love comes from the awareness of this growing wholeness within us. The divine presence as the gravitational energy of love works as a felt but unseen force, making us whole. When we are estranged from the divine, it pulls us toward reunion. When we are estranged from each other, it pulls us toward reunion. When we are estranged from creation, it pulls us toward reunion. Whenever we fall short of our full potential as human beings, whenever our lives are broken or fractured, the gravitational energy of love seeks to pull us back into the people we were created to be, to make us whole once more. To submit ourselves to this force, to be in relationship with and follow the ways of the divine presence, is to submit ourselves to love, to give ourselves over to the uniting power of love, and to love the divine, our neighbors, and ourselves as we are loved by the divine. In this way, we begin to live in harmony with the divine, the force of love that permeates the universe, and are united in love. When this happens, when the gravitational force of love has united us with the divine presence, another person or creation, we feel it as the emotion of love, the warmth and contentment that we often associate with love, the feeling that all is as it should be. And so here I begin to talk about, and more elsewhere in the book, kind of about the nature of the relationship between us and God. And I want to share one of my poems. For each reading, there's a poem. And that also kind of, I think, talks about the relationship between us and God, and where we might stand today. And the poem is called The Scream. So if you think of the famous painting named The Scream. And poem's dedicated to Orlando, from those who lost their lives on June 12, 2016. And it begins with a quote from Edward Munch. Munch? Anybody know how to pronounce his name? Monk. Edvard Munch. One evening I was walking along a path. The city was on one side and the fjord below. I felt tired and ill. I stopped and looked out over the fjord. The sun was setting and the clouds turning blood red. I sensed a scream passing through nature. It seemed to me that I heard the scream. I painted this picture, painted the clouds as actual blood. The color shrieked. This became the scream. Edvard Munch. We are the instruments of God. If that's all God has to work with, we're doomed. An off-key, out-of-sync marching band parading off a cliff, cheered on by the bombastic blaring of trumpets. Is that why the man is screaming under the blood-red sky? Oh, how the crimson shrieks. Is it the horror of two men tenderly kissing? Is it the horror of 49 souls now missing? Is it the scream of a bad dream? Is it the blood raining from the clouds running down the walls? Is it the tears flooding over the shrouds, cascading as an angel falls? Or is God screaming? And the man cowers as the shriek of nature's despair echoes, the cacophony of a marching band parading off a cliff. So not a happy poem, but yeah, I mean, I think it tries to think about and reflect on our relationship with the holy, and maybe especially where we've gone wrong, and that separation that we find between us and the divine. And I think that separation is important to consider. Relationship as separation, or separation within our relationship. And so that kind of brings me to a second reading from the book, which comes from the chapter on sin, page 79 to 81. And this section is subtitled, Neither Naughty Nor Nice, Defining Sin. Used to bolster the power and influence of the institutional church, the concept of sin may be one of the most abused Christian doctrines. A cynical view of the doctrine of sin might perceive how the institutional church historically has sought to establish our human sinfulness, convincing us that we are inherently bad or even evil, while lowering self-esteem and inducing guilt, not necessarily over anything we've done, but because of our very existence. Jesus is proclaimed as our salvation, but that often seems to be little more than a smokescreen, because approved access to Jesus is through the church. The church itself becomes the only path to forgiveness and salvation, with the threat of eternal damnation looming over our heads as the alternative. One might come to understand such a doctrine to be primarily a vehicle to keep people under the power of the institutional church. The popular understanding of sin as wrongdoing, especially when combined with the idea of original sin, has done much harm. People are beat down and ostracized over their sins. Inherent sin was once used to justify the slavery of blacks. Even today, the perception of black people as somehow bad and therefore inferior is integral to sustaining racism in our culture. Queer people have also suffered from the stigma of their so-called sinfulness. Theologian Patrick Chang notes that sin talk remains at the heart of the oppression and suffering, emotional, spiritual, psychological, and physical, that LGBT people experience today. Sin understood as inherent wrongdoing and badness leads to the condemnation of queer people as evil at the very core of who they are. It is no wonder that one tendency, especially among queer people, is to reject talk of sin altogether, because such talk has been used to reject them. Yet the idea of sin is deeply embedded in Christianity. At its best, it can help us reflect on our nature and the ethical conundrum of how we label things as good and bad. It can remind us that we fall short of perfection and that we need the help of the divine presence and the help of family, friends, and spiritual community to make it through this life. The idea of sin can also remind us of the importance of forgiveness. What is needed is a way of understanding what sin really means. Thinking of sin strictly as wrongdoing is fraught with too many problems to be useful any longer. The answer, in fact, lies within Christian tradition. While the concept may be new to many church-going Christians, Catherine Keller notes that sin was traditionally defined as separation from God. And Paul Tillich, rejecting sin as a failure to act in the right way, defines it as a state of estrangement from that to which one belongs: God, oneself, one's world. Therefore, sin as a concept means to be separated from the divine presence, and thus from divine love, by which I don't mean the warm, fuzzy feelings we sometimes associate with love, but instead a deep caring and compassion for creation, for other people, and for ourselves. If we talk of sin as an action, it refers to those things we might do or think that cause us to be separated from the divine presence, those things that keep us from being caring and compassionate, that keep us from being loved or loving others, that sabotage our relationships with the divine presence and each other. At times in our lives and to varying degrees, we will all find ourselves separated from the divine presence. It is part of being human. In fact, as discussed previously, separation is a consequence of realizing our freedom as humans. In this sense, original sin does exist. Every human being experiences this separation and the corresponding yearning for reunion. Of course, the term sin is so tied to the idea of wrongdoing, it's tempting to reject it completely and seek other ways of expressing what sin represents. However, Tillich argues that the word sin shouldn't be replaced because it implies a personal responsibility that is lacking in other possible terminology, such as separated, or his own favored word, estrangement. To talk of our being separated from the divine says nothing about how that existential gap is to be bridged. The term sin carries with it the implication of our own responsibility for our separation, or perhaps more accurately, for our reunion. The divine presence invites and pulls us toward reunion, but in our freedom, we must choose to follow. And so that's kind of the way I define sin for my theology, for my understanding of the holy. And then, of course, as a Christian, I see Christ then as kind of the healer of our separation, the healer of our sin, in that way becoming Savior. And so the next reading I'm going to do is about Christ and one image that we can use when talking about Christ. Because we do use different images. In pictures, we might see Christ as blue eyes and blonde hair, even though we know that's not what Jesus looked like. But like that, we also see counter images to that, the black Christ or an Asian Christ. And we also have an image of a queer Christ. And so that's kind of what I'm going to read next. But first, I want to share another poem that just fits in because it is a poem about my experience as a gay man. And so this is called River or Rock. And again, dedicated to those who lost their lives in Orlando in 2016. The ghost of childhood winters chills the summer heat, skipping across the field behind Bingham Elementary, stopping on mounds of plow-driven snow where laughing 12-year-olds once gathered. This was our game. Claim your domain, defend against all comers. I often stood as king of those hills. Pushed and shoved, I stood resolute, strong, unmovable, the second biggest kid in grade 6, without fear for one glorious year. But there was no king in this contest. We called it Smear the Queer. Now in my 50th year, we still play childish games that aren't games, now with guns. While too many push and shove, refusing queer to be worn with self-assurance only in derision, I still stand, still the queer, resolute, strong, unmovable. But 49 more pulsing ghosts threaten the strong, unmovable me with an erosion of spirit, an avalanche into oblivion. Colorado began wearing down the Grand Canyon millions of years ago. Am I river or rock? Either way, there's not that much time. And so I offer, particularly for queer people, but I think for everyone, this image of the queer Christ. I'm going to read from 110 to running on to 112. But Jesus the Christ does more than reveal to us an image of what an ideal human looks like. That is, he does not present us with a single picture to which we must all adhere. Instead, Christ is a symbol of multiplicity and not singularity. Jesus the Christ shows us that the divine presence is in all things by breaking through the human divine boundary. As the ultimate model of what humanity is and can be, he reveals to us the many and diverse ways the divine manifests in humans, appearing to us in a multiplicity of ways. One way Christ appears to us as a multiplicity is through the theological images that we use to talk about and understand his impact on our life. These images morph or shapeshift into the revelation that is needed by the recipient. Examples include such images as the black Christ, the Asian Christ, and the queer Christ. This is one instance where partially personifying the divine presence through images of the Christ makes sense because these images of Christ help provide new meaning to those unsure about the relevance of Christ or who have rejected or been rejected by the church. Of course, the queer Christ is of particular interest to queer people who don't conform to cultural norms of heterosexuality. Just as Jesus Christ says that he takes the form of the least among us, the queer Christ is the particular image of Christ as a marginalized queer person. Just as the image of a black Christ suggests that Christ and the gospel message is not just for white people, the queer Christ emphasizes that the gospel is not just for heterosexual people. The queer Christ transgresses the boundaries of the male heterosexual asexual Christ model traditionally presented by the figure of Jesus. It helps to undermine the oppressive power of institutional Christianity in their treatment of the marginalized. This is the Christ that stands up for anyone who has ever felt they don't belong. The queer Christ is important because it allows us to recognize ourselves in Christ and the Christ in ourselves, thus helping to further reveal the divinity of all people, and especially queer people, and affirm our inherent worth and the spiritual treasures to be found within each of us. For queer people to identify with the queer Christ and find meaning in that image, we must understand the queer Christ as a fully human, imperfect, sexual Christ, who is still fully divine and not necessarily male. Because the Christian church has so often told queer people that they are not fully human, the queer Christian must be able to see their full humanity in Christ in order to know the fallacy of that teaching. We must know that the queer Christ struggled as we struggle, truly understanding the queer person, and yet lived in harmony with the divine presence, not in spite of his queerness, but because of it. The queer Christ in whom we can see our true human potential is a great hope for all of humanity and not just queer people. In disrupting the image of the heterosexual, asexual, gender-conforming Christ that reinforces the doctrine of that everyone must be like me, God, the queer Christ opens access to the divine presence to not only queer people, but all people who fail to conform in some way. In so doing, the queer Christ enriches all of us by lifting up and celebrating the diversity and sacredness of all of the divine presence's good creation. So I think an important part for me of the queer Christ is to remind us that we are indeed all sacred. And so kind of the next poem I want to share tries to reflect on what happens when we forget that life is sacred. It's called Living on a Floodplain. And although it's in the poem a metaphor, but perhaps it hits home a little bit with all of the hurricanes and such that are going on right now. Living on a floodplain. Some days it drizzles. A black man's taillight fails him. A toddler finds daddy's new toy. Some days it pours. The music stops pulsing for late-night dancers. Revelers storm the Bastille for the last time. But every day the waters rise, stalk their unwitting prey. The bootstrap cracks widen, threaten to breach the dam, to drown us in post-disaster anarchy. As the red waters fill our basements and soak our carpets, we retreat to the rooftops, throwing daggers with one breath. Someone must be at fault after all, someone must pay. And in the next, desperately calling help, help, as we wait for the helicopters and rescue boats that never seem to come. Used once or twice and put away, the starcraft stored in the garage, upon whose bow we had proudly painted its name in our piety, the golden rule, slumbers, a forgotten gift. And so the last reading I want to do from the book hopefully talks a little bit about what happens when we remember the sacredness of life and come together in and as the church. And so this is from page 141 to 143. Ministry, or doing the work of the divine, is the building of the kingdom and is necessarily done in community. The church is the banding together of the faithful for mutual support and encouragement. Lillian Daniel proposes that practicing our faith is like dance. We are called to dance together. Ministry is done together. We do ministry as the church community and not to the community or for the community. We dance our faith with each other and not as a performance for one another. At its ideal, the church witnesses to the world of the love of the divine presence and what it means to live in the kingdom. Authors Gregory Jones and Kevin Armstrong claim that as Christians we are called to cultivate a common life marked by the mind of Christ. That is, we are called to gather as Christ's church, living together according to the values of the kingdom, as examples of the kingdom for the world. We are called to live together in hope, love, peace, and justice. Of course, the church often fails to live by these values, sometimes in small ways and sometimes on a grand scale. Our failings expose our humanity and imperfection, often alienating and driving away those who seek the true kingdom, who see the church's hypocrisy when it fails to recognize or acknowledge its failures. But our propensity for failure doesn't change the call from the divine presence to build the kingdom. Instead, what it means is that we need to better learn the humility needed to admit our mistakes, to forgive ourselves and others who have hurt us, and to begin again. This is the Christian principle of resurrection. The promise of the divine presence is that new life can and will arise from death, that we can rise from the ashes of our failures to find new and abundant life. To be truly alive requires that church communities practice the amorous justice of the kingdom of the divine presence, according to Catherine Keller. That the justice of the kingdom is to be amorous would seem to be a reflection of Jesus' commandment to love the divine presence and to love one's neighbor as oneself. Both Jesus and the Apostle Paul claim that all the law and the prophets are based on this command to love. All we do as Christians should be based on these principles of love. It follows then that the first and foremost thing with which ministry should be concerned is loving the divine presence, loving neighbor, and loving self. When Jesus washes the feet of his disciples, he gives us an example of service to those around him and tells his disciples to do likewise, reinforcing this with the command that they love one another. By their love, they will be known. It's important to realize the connection between Jesus washing the feet of the disciples and his command to love one another. This command is about a new way of relating to those around us. It goes against the grain of our American cowboy culture of brave independence. Instead, it is grounded in Jesus' relationship with the disciples and with the divine, and is shaped by the example he sets for us, teaching, healing, and being a servant to all of the divine's beloved children. He sets for us a pattern of service, of humility, and of bearing the burdens of one another. So I will end my little talk with another poem and then give you a chance to ask questions if you have any questions. This poem is titled Postscript to Wendell Berry's Mad Farmer Manifesto. And it has some adult language, but we're all over 18, so plug your ears if you can't handle it. If you've never read Wendell Berry's poem about the Mad Farmer Liberation Front Manifesto, go home and Google it tonight because it's a wonderful poem. And so this is written kind of as an add-on or a postscript response to his, especially taking off on the last line of his poem, which is Practice Resurrection. So, postscript to Wendell Berry's Mad Farmer Manifesto. Walk a mile in the crazy, angry farmer's overalls and join the ranks of perturbed earth lovers trying to grow majestic oaks in rank swampland. Maybe the mad farmer should have gone Luther on their asses and nailed his manifesto to every church door in America instead of writing a poem. Who listens to poets anyway? What was this angry agriculturalist trying to grow? Food to nourish the body? Revolutionaries for the new reality which was never to be? Maybe just some wacky tobacco? But the farmer gives good manifesto. Care more about your unborn grandchildren than yourselves. Worry about something other than profit. Be countercultural. Practice resurrection. How un-American. Next thing we'll be told to love our neighbor. Listen up, people. Or to quote another poet, heart, dumbass. A manifesto is not a request, a polite suggestion. A manifesto is a demand, a command. This isn't preseason training. We're not talking a resurrection scrimmage. If it's practice, then when will it be for real? When will it really count? This is it. Death is winning. The world is going to shit. We can wallow like pigs, enjoying the stench of our demise, or we can crazy up and recycle that fertilizer to grow something preposterous, something unexpected. Practice resurrection. Don't just talk about theory, practice. Don't just give lip service to some future glory that we get handed to us on a silver platter after we've totally fucked up this world. If we can't take care of each other, why do we think we'll be allowed to get our grubby little hands on heaven? Practice resurrection as your profession. Practice like a doctor and heal wounds. Practice like a lawyer and seek justice. Practice like a teacher and tutor thinkers. God knows thinking is a lost art. Practice like an artist and create beauty. Then do it again. Learn, improve, repeat. Be resurgent, defy death. The grave would claim us all as fast as we can dig the hole. Be a resurrectionist and rob the grave of its hold on you. Don't run willingly to a morose living death. Rise again, and then again. Learn, improve, repeat. Be insurgent, cheat death. Not only rise again from death, but rise up against the forces of death. Resist that which would kill us. Practice resurrection, create life. Seek physical touch instead of electronic pokes. Try to understand someone you think is unhinged. Relationship immersion. Get off Facebook and make a real fucking friend. Champion a cause. Be more substantive than 140 characters allows. Belong to community. Even rootin' tootin' cowboys need each other. Get off your ass and do something. Give the homeless a coat. Give the hungry a meal. Save the earth. Walk instead of drive. Deny yourself whale-clogging plastic. Hug a stranger. Just smile at someone, for God's sake. No, not for God's sake, for our sake. Practice resurrection not because some mad farmer or some mad God tells you to. Practice resurrection because it's the only choice we have left. Give up negativity. Don't listen to or propagate bullshit lies that will lead to a world filled with nothing but cockroaches and radiation. Trust in someone who preaches love instead of fear. Choose peace over violence. Choose hope over despair. Even if it doesn't make any sense. Resurrection doesn't. Pay attention to the good in your life. Get your nose out of the hate and violence in the newspaper and go smell a rose. If you can't choose how you feel, choose what you do. Do what's right even when it's not easy. The easy thing is to go for the quick buck. Plan for a future beyond next quarter's profits while living today to its fullest. Practice resurrection. When part of you dies, reinvent yourself, live again. Lose a job, rekindle your passion and let it lead you somewhere new. Lose a partner, blindly put your faith in the buoyancy of love and jump back in the sea. Take life's leftovers and make resurrection pie. Ignore what the world would make of you. Be true to yourself. Create new life. Grow something. Love someone. Love everyone. Listen to the angry, crazy poet farmer in your soul. Practice resurrection. And so ends the formal part of my presentation.